Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to a very topical issue, but also one which is very relevant to the kinds of organizational failures and dysfunctions that we've been studying all semester. The problem is the problem of reforming police departments and the fact that police reform has been so extremely difficult over the past 20 years in the United States. The problem, as we all know, is a very pressing one. There's a pattern of excessive use of force by US police officers against young men of color, disproportionately leading to death for the victim. Recurring promises have been made to reform police departments and to change police behavior, to eliminate racial bias in policing, and to eliminate unjustified violence and force against the public. And yet reform efforts, including those mandated by the Department of Justice, have been notably unsuccessful. So the question for us is, why has police reform been so difficult to achieve? Let's get a sense of the magnitude of the problem. The Washington Post has created a database of police shootings since 2015, which has simply striking data. The web page is mentioned here. More than 5,000 deaths are recorded in this 5-year period, 2015 to 2020. And Black individuals are 2.4 times as likely to be shot as white individuals. And Latinx individuals are 1.8 times as likely to be shot as white individuals. Plainly, there are severe racial disparities involved in these data. Black and brown people are much more likely to be shot by police than white people. And we have some understanding in the United States of what the background is, the background of kind of structural racism and a very long-standing racism in the American public and American institutions. But recent coverage of police force against young men of color demonstrates the fact that even minor infractions, like an unlit license plate, can lead to a traffic stop, which can in turn lead to an unjustified use of lethal force. These are tragic stories to read, and disproportionately, these traffic stops and these uses of force have been applied against young men of color. We also know that there's a widespread use of racial profiling across the United States. And again, this is documented. And racial profiling leads to a situation in which Black and brown young people, often men, probably most often men, are disproportionately likely to be stopped by the police. Michelle Alexander captures this very pervasive racism in our criminal justice system in her magnificent book, The New Jim Crow. So what is the organizational problem? Why is police reform so difficult? Who are the players? We can start there. The public has an interest, though not a consistent interest. Legislators have an interest, both at the national level, the state level, and even the town level or city level. The Department of Justice plays a role. And then local elected officials like the mayor, city council, the chief of police, supervisors and managers in a police department, and officers. These are the actors of the players within a police department. And it is that complex, that strategic action field, which demands reform. What are the organizational tools that are available for reforming police departments or changing the behavior, or for that matter, making behavior consistent? Well, there is the possibility of training. And of course, police departments do a lot of training. There is the possibility of supervision, where supervisors are monitoring and viewing the behavior and conduct of individuals under their scope of control, and are correcting their behavior when they engage in misconduct. There is the writing of policy, regulations, how to handle specific kinds of policy, kinds of circumstances. For example, when it is legitimate to draw a weapon. There are processes of accountability And there's finally the pervasive fact of police culture, which we'll talk about shortly. There's an old joke that you've probably heard. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. When we apply that to police departments, how much effort is needed to reform a police department? Well, not very much if the police department wants to change, but regrettably, that is often not the case. So police culture is clearly an important part of police behavior, and it is also an important feature of the situation in which police reform is intended to be implemented. Unfortunately, I'm not able to find any really compelling, broad, empirical statement of what the diverse police cultures are in different cities in the United States. So I'm going to just pull out one scenario, one particularly unsympathetic scenario for the possibility of police department reform. It's a police culture in which there is a strong split between us and them, between the police department and the civilian authorities, between the chief and the department on the one hand, and the mayor, the city council, other civilian authorities on the other hand. So us versus them. Within such a context, a police chief often seeks to maintain his or her autonomy with respect to civilian authorities, which often means withholding information, disguising information, and making misconduct difficult to ascertain. Third, there's in order to kind of lay out a culture, I'm hypothesizing that officers have embodied practices, prejudices, routines, and attitudes which guide their activity. They don't come as tabula rasa, rather they have specific ways in which they approach various situations that police have to confront: a traffic stop, confronting a burglar, confronting a situation in the street, and so forth. But there's another us versus them situation in policing that makes reform difficulty, and that is the conflictual relationship that often exists within a police department between officers, supervisors, internal affairs investigators, and the chief, each different type of actor expressing distrust and suspicion towards the other actors. So officers not trusting supervisors, et cetera. And then finally, there's the situation of a code of silence, the idea that there's a norm that police officers should not reveal misconduct by their fellow officers. So let's consider the failure of reform by kind of thinking through the Klemko-Sullivan article in the Washington Post, which I asked you to read. It's the best of the materials which I asked you to read, and I think it has a lot of really useful, interesting observations. I've tried to pull out the statements which are specifically about organizational features which make organizational change and reform more difficult. First of all is a pervasive fact of biases and assumptions about people of color, which permeate the ranks of police officers and the rest of society, except that there's the real possibility that these biases and prejudices are more extensive in certain police departments. Second, there is the fact that there are legal impediments to establishing officer accountability. There is something called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which has been embodied in some state laws. There are union contracts which attempt to do the same. And the purpose of these pieces of legislation and contracts is to protect officers against charges when they are charged with police misconduct. The summary statement, which the authors of this Washington Post article offer, is worth reading. The attempts at reform have been stifled by entrenched cultures, systemic dysfunction, shifts in leadership, and swings in public mood. Outrage at officers' conduct eventually gives way to demand for aggressive enforcement when crime flares and the cycle continues. And the Department of Justice investigation of the Pittsburgh Police Department, which was for a period of time thought to be a fairly successful intervention. However, when the federal monitors moved on nearly a decade later, the pressure for reform had dissipated and reform ceased. Other factors which are mentioned in the article, again, all of which seem promising when we're looking for impediments to reform, the lack of diversity in police forces. Only 4% of the new officers hired in Pittsburgh in the period of time mentioned here are officers of color. A lack of buy-in for reform by rank and file officers, a lack of willingness to consider that the reforms in question are good for policing, good for the police officers, and good for the public. Changes of leadership are mentioned as an important impediment to progress and reform. Quote, for reform to work, you have to have a chief who can lead it, a city government that supports it, and officers and unions who go along, said McNeely, who was chief of the department from 96 to 2006. But politics change, and that's usually what ends a reform. They hire supporters instead of leaders. This kind of change of leadership and change of priorities leads to a loss of institutional will and priority for the establishment of reform and non-racist policing. A final factor which is identified in this Post article and which seems to be crucially important is a lack of effective supervision, mentoring, and accountability for problem officers. The fact that problem officers are allowed to stay in uniform, return to work, or move to another police department without ever correcting their behavior. So how does culture change work? I think we've talked about culture change in a lot of different contexts throughout the course, but I'll just summarize a few points about culture change. First of all, it's fairly clear that any organization has a culture, and the daily workings of the individuals within the organization are constituted by the activities and behaviors of the people who make it up. So the activities and behaviors of the people who make up the organization, whether it's a university or a hospital or a police department, their attitudes, norms, practices, and so forth, that constitutes the culture of the organization. These habitual modes of behavior may conform, better or worse, to the official expectations and rules of behavior that are established for the performance of their roles. And it is a commonplace in organizational studies to notice that individual behavior within an organization often deviates from the job description or from the code of conduct in the organization. Furthermore, there's a social effect. Habits and expectations by individuals are often mutually reinforcing. So the fact that Alex, Bob, and Charlie have certain ways of conducting their work often reinforces the similar behaviors of David. For example, the police officers in Pittsburgh, mentioned in the article, often had very specific habits and expectations when it came to encounters with drivers, suspects, or strangers. A lot of use of force, a harsh tone of voice, a ready display of disrespect. These habits of behavior are infectious. New recruits model the behavior of their elders, and soon they are just as violent and disrespectful as the previous generation. I hope we can discuss this idea and just test out. Does this seem like a credible idea? Can we evaluate this idea? Or is it a hypothesis that really doesn't work out? And therefore, a police commander who wants to reform the style of policing, the manner of policing in his district, is faced with a very difficult problem. Changing policing means changing behavior of individual police on the street, but the tools available to the commander to bring about these changes are very limited. So the habits, the practices persist in spite of orders, regulations, training, briefings, and seminars. Within a traditional hierarchical understanding of organizations, almost a military understanding, these conflicts between habits and practices and the official expectations of the organization should be resolved through supervision. Nonconformist behavior, noncompliant behavior can be identified and penalized. Violent officers can be punished or dismissed, and other nonconformist or noncompliant workers can be disciplined in various ways. But there are two problems with this supervisory solution to the problem. One is the cost of close supervision, which is an issue which we talked about when we talked about principal agent problems. It simply isn't realistic to imagine having enough supervisors to detect a high percentage of bad behavior by workers. Workers need to be motivated by an internal motivation, which leads them generally to act properly rather than badly. But the second problem is the possibility that supervisors themselves may share the habits, practices, and attitudes of the officers whom they oversee. So police culture probably does extend from officers to supervisors and mid-level managers. Resistance to cultural change is a commonplace. We understand that in organizations, there are individuals who resist culture change. And if there is a high level of cynicism and disaffection among workers, whether policemen or doctors and nurses in a hospital or university professors, it is likely that the performance of both the workers and the managers will deviate from the organization's expectations of how they will behave. So the problem of culture change is the problem of changing those assumptions and habits on the part of workers and managers. It's also the problem of winning over those actors to the goals of the reform which is underway. One of the documents I asked you to read was a Human Rights Watch document on police reform. And a lot of the observations were more sociological, but three had organizational content. First of all, the Human Rights Watch document recommends establish independent community oversight bodies with full access to police records, subpoena power, authority to conduct investigations, and the power to discipline officers and command staff. I would like for you to notice how incredibly powerful this recommendation is. It is almost inconceivable that any American city would establish an independent community oversight body with all of these powers. Generally, they're advisory and have to wheedle information and recommend consequences. The second recommendation is more feasible: to collect data on police activities disaggregated by race and gender and ethnicity, and to make it public. So in other words, facts about police misconduct should be made public so the public can assess the performance of the police department. And then third, as we saw mentioned also in the Washington Post article, remove federal and state legal immunities that protect law enforcement officers from liability, as well as laws that keep police misconduct records inaccessible to the public. That recommendation in particular seems to have a lot of weight. The Brookings report that you took a look at has some of the same recommendations. It also recommends reforming qualified immunity, which is basically the legal implementation of the idea that a police officer is declared to be immune from liability when performing his or her tasks. Second, a recommendation for national standards for training and de-escalation of conflictual situations. Third, a recommendation to restructure civilian payouts for police misconduct. It's a little odd to realize that when a police department is sued for civil liability for a multi-million-dollar finding in favor of the person who was mistreated by the police, that liability goes to the city, not to the police department. And so the recommendation here is that those payouts should be in some way reflected in the budget and the insurance premiums of the police department itself. A fourth recommendation, mental health counseling should be more widely available for officers. There should be a return to community policing, closer and more trusting relationships between police and community members. There should be a restructuring of union contracts so that the union is not an impediment to reforms which will change police behavior. And then finally, there's a recommendation, who shall bell the cat? There should be a change of police culture. The Alpert and McDonald article, I'm not going to say anything about this because in the end, I didn't find it especially useful. So here we're involved in an open-ended consideration of a very difficult situation, difficult problem to both understand and to resolve. I think that the tools and the insights which we've learned through this course are very relevant to understanding why police departments function as they do, why they fail to function better, and why reform is difficult. In fact, we can identify a lot of the organizational and institutional dysfunctions that impede the likelihood of enduring police reform. And many of the topics we've discussed earlier are certainly relevant. So safety culture, or protect the public, or avoid racist practices. That culture of policing, which we would like to establish, is crucial. Second, priorities that are expressed from the top need to be implemented and clearly stated. So it needs to be clear that the top managers, the police chief, the mayor, are all concerned to end racist police practices and excessive use of force, et cetera. There ought to be involvement of top managers in the process activities of the police department. In other words, there shouldn't be the sharp separation between executives who are in one police plaza and the street officers. Police managers should have a good understanding of what actually is happening on the streets. There should be strong attention paid to weak signals. We've understood how important weak signals are in hospitals, in universities, in sexual harassment situations, and in policing. Police departments should learn from the learning organization literature. They should become learning organizations, and they should find ways of improving their performance year after year. And there are specific things which can be undertaken in order to do that. And then finally, the idea of normalization of deviance actually does seem to explain a fair amount of the misconduct and the organizational dysfunction of police departments, which are otherwise really hard to understand. But we can add two other ideas, which we haven't mentioned in the course and maybe are not so important in other areas of organizational life. But first of these is the idea that in policing, there is often an antecedent oppositional culture and a social psychology of opposition in many of the actors. We could speculate that perhaps people are recruited to police work because they have an oppositional character or an aggressive character. But whether it's learned or a piece of character which they bring to the job, there does seem to be a toughness and an oppositional psychological disposition in police officers, which makes reform difficult. But there's another feature which is more about organizational behavior, and it is the effect on individual behavior, whether you're a doctor or a nurse or a professor or a police officer, the effect which your role and the power that you have, these factors can influence your behavior and can sometimes lead to bad behavior. So having a gun, having a nightstick, having the ability to arrest, this may actually bring out the worst in people. And all of these factors suggest that police reform is hard to design. Hard to design. It's not surprising that police reform has been largely unsuccessful in the United States. Hard to design in a way which makes it both stable and enduring. There's one final question I'd like to leave you with, and that is the question of infiltration of police departments by right-wing violent extremists. Do we need to be concerned about the infiltration of police departments by violent right-wing extremists? This question has come to the fore after the January 6th riot in the Capitol building, and the fact that there were police officers and sheriff or deputies who were involved in that riot. And more attention has been paid around the country, and have realized that there are followers of Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and other extremist organizations, Oath Keepers, who have found their way into police departments and sheriff's departments. And is this a concerning situation? I find it concerning. And we have to ask the question, will citizens be protected in the exercise of their rights of protest in particular, from the threat of armed extremists, if representatives of the armed extremists are themselves police officers? And then finally, we can ask the organizational question, or maybe it's the HR question: what discipline and screening checks are available which could be utilized to prevent this possibility? There's a nice piece in the New York Times, which I've given you a link to here, which explores some of these issues in the last couple of months. Okay, it's a tough, big subject. We don't have a huge amount of time to discuss it, but I'm very happy that it was possible to bring this topic into the course this year.